You think he had kids? Everyone took their turn asking. Me, Brian, Dad. It was a good question because nobody knew the answer. So we kept asking even after the chip pile was out of sight. Bundled in the cabin of the truck, we were safe. And we fought off the idea of the stranger's body like it was an invading army coming to take our castle. But you think he had kids? Brian asked again. We couldn't not talk about him, but we would have asked anything to avoid having to think about the poor bastard directly. Christ, what a way to go. He have a wife? I asked.
Jerry didn't know. Said the guy was new.
My father bit his lip, and then bit his cheek. When that wasn't enough, he scratched his head as if he could dig out the thoughts. Usually, my father collected deaths the way people collected jokes. He had 100 stories from the safety committee at the sawmill. There was nothing he enjoyed more than saying that a guy died that way. But this death was too morbid even for macabre tastes. We'd all heard everything Jerry said. Now, we were just repeating it to one another to make sure we'd all heard the same things.
Stupid kid should have known better than to get out of his truck. Dumb fuck should have never walked down to the chip pile,
my father muttered. Unable to translate his frustration, my father turned to Brian and I and suddenly screamed.
Don't ever let me hear that you two been walking out on the chip pile.
Neither of us said that we didn't work at the mill, or that you couldn't drive up to the chip pile if you didn't work at the mill, or that the chip pile was behind a locked gate. Brian and I just said, "We won't, Dad," and kept trying not to think of that poor truck driver. When we were over the bridge and the mill was out of sight, it seemed safe enough to bring up the body. Not the accident itself, just the body. You think there'll be enough left to bury? I asked. My father snorted.
They'll be lucky to find a pinky finger. I'm sorry for the poor fucker they sent down there to clean the auger.
The person they sent down later was my uncle. I have many uncles, and all of them are the kind of men called upon to do unpleasant things. He found red wood chips and, indeed, a pinky. Nothing much else you could call a person. There had been no ambulances when we'd arrived at the chip pile, although when we'd first driven past there had been one leaving the scene. The ambulance hadn't even had its lights on. The fact that we'd seen it at all had been an accident. Maybe you've got to send an ambulance when someone dies, even if there's no body. Regulations or something. Even when there's nothing to save, you've just got to send an ambulance. Just for show. Just so someone can check a box. If I were ever cut in a million bloody pieces, all I'd want is for someone to be sent with a gun in case there was enough of me left to feel pain. I let out a hollow laugh when I remembered the sign by the front offices of the mill. Somebody had already changed it. 0 days since last accident. What a way to break the streak. The first time we'd driven past and seen the ambulance, my father had wondered aloud what had happened. After we'd killed a couple hours at Dutch's house, borrowing something or other, my father was forever needing to borrow some tool that belonged to Dutch. We had stopped by the mill on the way back. He'd worked there for over 30 years, so the guard let him through without any trouble. Didn't even care that us kids were in the truck with him. We all knew. All the kids of the men at the mill knew. You don't walk on the chip pile Not ever. Especially not when there's a barge docked. The guards knew that my dad wasn't stupid enough to let us walk on the chip pile. In a lumber town, everyone knew that. Or at least, everyone was supposed to know that. It was a short drive up to the barge facility, right next to the chip pile. Then my dad had asked his friend Jerry what happened, and Jerry had told us that the guy on duty at the chip pile had been out back taking a shit. Then some new truck driver came up to get a load of chips. Didn't know not to get out of his truck. Didn't know not to walk on the chip pile. Got impatient, and then walked out on the chip pile, probably trying to find someone. Maybe he did it just because he thought standing on top of a mountain of sawdust and wood chips would be cool. A 200-foot mound of wood chips? That's a pretty cool thing. Maybe he wanted a picture? That's when the auger started. When he was out there. The augers had turned on automatically because there was a barge waiting to be filled with chips. The chip pile, the augers, the barge. That was the way it had been for 100 years. My dad didn't press Jerry too much for details after that, but I could imagine the confusion. There probably hadn't been any screams. Just an empty truck with no driver in sight. Then an empty truck that had been there for a while. Then, someone had looked out in the chip pile and seen a spot of red. When we were in our own driveway, Brian had asked us what we'd all been wondering. Do you think it was quick? I hoped so. I could imagine that poor dumb kid out there on the chip pile when the auger started. The whole pile trembling, until suddenly it was like standing on quicksand, until it was trembling so fast it was like drowning in a sea of sawdust. I could imagine him trying to claw his way out, digging into the wood chips until they cut up his hands, digging with his bloody hands but still not finding any purchase. All the while sliding down into those whirring blades. Did he scream, buried in wood chips, when the auger caught his foot? Did he cry the name of his wife or his children? And how long did he spend screaming before his body had been chewed up by the auger enough to kill him? Did he go into shock when it had eaten him up to his waist? Or did he bleed to death when half his body was suddenly just gone? I hoped. Not long. I hoped he had gone in head first. Yeah, I said. It was probably quick.
Fuck no,
my father sighed, pulling the keys out of the ignition.
Those augers are dull as shit.